Good morning, everybody. Welcome to OP Radio. You're hearing a different voice than usual. I'm Lindsay. I'm a content strategist at OP Labs, filling in for my colleague Mac, who's on holiday. Mac will be back next week, rested up, ready to deliver that sweet, sweet content. And I'm going to try and hold down the fort in his absence. Helping me do that today, I'm joined by a fellow optimist, Justine, who works at the Optimism Foundation. She's such an interesting and brilliant person, and I'm so excited to talk to her today about the Collective DAO Archives, an amazing open source resource she created that's filled with insights on DAO governance and policy. Welcome, Justine.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome. So I guess we can get started by giving the people some context. What do you do at the Optimism Foundation?
I joined the Optimism Foundation basically when it launched, like the day that I saw the foundation existed. I reached out and I was like, I would like to work here. And I do like pretty much anything and everything related to governance. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it. If it's related to governance, then I'm probably involved.
Mm-hmm. And what's your previous background? Like, how do you get from? How do you get to the point where you're like, please, I would like to work here?
Yeah. Okay, so I have an unusual background. After high school, I was a professional ballerina. That's what I did for 6 years for a living. And then I went to university and worked in TradFi. So I was equity research analyst at a big investment bank in New York. I later worked at like a deep tech venture fund. So highly technical, like semiconductors and alternative computing methods, et cetera. Kind of while I was at the investment bank is when I got into crypto. So this was kind of like early 2017. At the bank, I was covering large cap internet. That was my sector. So Amazon, Google, Facebook, whatever. And I was like building out financial models for those companies for like 4 years and becoming like increasingly more horrified about how that whole system worked. So then, anyways, a friend told me to listen to this podcast about Ethereum. And I was like, oh, wow, we could use this as like a different architecture that would prevent a lot of these problems that these companies are creating, basically. So I had been involved in this space. And the first thing I did was actually grant funded research on identity and reputation. I did some policy work with different organizations. I was involved in various capacities, but joined the space full time after working at the venture fund. I joined a startup called Rabbit Hole, and I did many things there because I was like person number 12 or something. But one of the things that I did there was help to stand up their meta governance pod, which was 35 contributors from their community that were using the tokens that Rabbit Hole has in its treasury to participate in governance for 9 different protocols. And so I was basically a delegate alongside the contributors at these 9 protocols, and having that like broad exposure to what governance looked like at that many DAOs, you could start to recognize like common patterns or things that could be standardized or things that worked at one DAO that maybe a different DAO could utilize. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that became very interesting, and I started to look for also the other part of what I was doing at Rabbit Hole was kind of designing the roadmap for what they would look like as they decentralized, which is just going to happen on a longer time frame. So I started to look for these kind of like governance design type roles that at the time like didn't really exist. And anyways, I saw an opportunity to kind of do all of those things at Optimism. One of the things they needed when I reached out was someone to do like delegate relations. I was well suited for because I had been a delegate before, basically. So it helps me to have had that experience to kind of understand that user experience, basically.
Okay, yeah, that was kind of going to be my question, which is that what did you know that when you applied to Optimism that you would be sort of working so heavily on DAO policy and governance things? That sounds like that was the goal when you applied.
I mean, there was no job description like when I applied, and so I said I really like designing DAOs and like working on governance, and I definitely like to interact with the delegates, get feedback from them. This is like one of the things from the beginning I thought was really important, that there be a strong feedback loop between the delegates and kind of the creation or adjustment of the policy, right? Optimism wants to run these experiments. And so you really need to have that strong feedback loop to understand what's working and what's not, how to adjust it, and what experiments to run in the future. So I joined kind of like a rough understanding of what I would be working on, and then just kind of like based on what the needs were at the DAO and what my interests were, I kind of developed into this role.
Okay, yeah, very cool. And I imagine another thing that you need, this is going to be the most amazing segue to run those experiments, is like a lot of deep research on like what even are DAOs, what are best practices, how do we set them up? And I don't know if much of that existed when you started working here. So do you want to start talking about like what the collective DAO archives are?
Yeah. So this is like my background and my nature is to do just like an insane amount of research on everything. Part of that I think is because I've had 4 dramatically different careers, and so like this having to get up to speed on something new has has just like required me to do this deep research on different topics. Being a research analyst at a bank, like my job was to like analyze companies and do a lot of research. So I'm very fascinated with the potential that DAOs have. I think they're incredibly important, but also concerned because like many of them don't work well. And the other thing that I could see being a delegate across many DAOs is that they're not really like learning, sharing their learnings with each other, right? So you see one like mistake happen and then one DAO learns from it, but like the other DAO over here does not learn that lesson. And so I just think we could avoid many of these mistakes and accelerate the development of like the whole industry if we could share more of those learnings. I think we spend tons of time talking about how each DAO is different, which is true, but like I think there's a level that you can abstract it to where many things are the same, and that's where we can start to apply like common frameworks. And I think we could really benefit from doing. I think we get stuck in this pattern of saying like, well, that DAO is different than this DAO, so that principle couldn't possibly apply over here. And it's like I think there's a level that we can do it on where it does. So some of the questions that I kind of set out when we were thinking about how to design seasons or what experiments to run at Optimism is like there was kind of 2 questions. One, I just wanted to see how grants programs were run everywhere. And that was like a difficult thing to do. I had to go to like each different forum, and anybody that spends time in forums understands that they're like pretty hard to navigate. It's hard to find where the information is. I just wanted like a place I could go and search like grants programs, and then all the relevant proposals for the grants programs or landing pages or whatever would come up. It didn't exist, so I kind of started to put that together for myself in the role that I have at Optimism. Somebody might ask me a question about like liquid delegation or something, and I can use the governance library that's part of the collective archives and just type in like delegation and find like more or less what's relevant on that topic and see how other DAOs are doing it. And that allows us to, it just like accelerates our own ability, our own learning and our own progress to be able to look at what all the DAOs before us have done. It would be like really silly not to leverage all of the work and experiments that other DAOs have done. So that was one thing. And then the second thing was I was really curious if there were like I'm curious about this like this idea of a governance roadmap, which is very hard to define, and most DAOs don't publish. I think 0x at one point had some form of a governance roadmap that I found. And so I started to like build them myself, basically, which are what the timelines in the collective DAO archives are. And what I was trying to get at there was, are there commonalities in kind of like the evolution or progression of DAOs in terms of when they implement, say, delegated decision making or like a way to organize work, which just typically looks like working groups, or when a certain group in the DAO gains ownership of a multi-sig? And if there are kind of like common patterns in when that happens, can you start to extrapolate and understand what your own roadmap needs to look like? So, for example, if on average, after 10 months, the community tends to manage its own multi-sig, then we can design our own seasons and our own roadmap to be ready to have that happen in 10 months.
Yeah, it just gives you like a place to start in this sea of options for how to approach governance. You mentioned experiments, and we'll dig into that like later, like what experiments are in the context of the Optimism Collective and sort of how we approach that in the collective. But I imagine that the collective DAO archives, the library that you've put together, like it gives you a reference point and like, you know, like authority and real like evidence to kind of back up the things that you propose to delegate. So I imagine that it makes experiments easier, like proposing them and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So one thing I'll say is like these are open source resource. It's really a database and then kind of like a contextualized timeline. And I described like different ways that I use them, but anybody can use them to do like many different things, and everybody will draw different conclusions from looking at the same forum post or the same data, which I think is cool. Some people have reached out since we released them, explaining like different ways that they want to use the resources, different ways they want to expand them, build upon them. I intentionally built them all with just public accessible information, right? Nothing is token gated. I'm not a member of these DAOs. I don't know, like I didn't have inside information or inside access, because part of the point was to like illustrate the fact that all this information exists, is accessible to everybody. There's all this learning just out there on the internet. We just have to like do something with it. But there is a layer of context that is missing, and from like people that were actually implementing these things, or kind of like the behind the scenes drama that was happening in regards to some of these proposals. And so some people want to do work that kind of like layers in that context, which is another cool layer, but was just kind of separate from the work that I did as like the base layer. I think what you asked me about was like how we use these when we're thinking about designing experiments at Optimism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think the timelines definitely help inform like when the community, well, first of all, I think number one, like the community will tell you when they want something or when they're ready for something. Like delegates will let you know. So like that's like the number one signal that I would say we use. It becomes readily apparent what the delegates are asking for. And then the second thing is we can kind of use the timelines to understand what the next few steps are. You always feel like you're one step behind in DAOs. And so this helps us be, I don't know, maybe half a step behind. And then I think when we have an idea of what we want to do, like say fund work in the DAO or something, it's very helpful to be able to understand kind of all the structures other people have experimented with, what has worked, what hasn't worked. There's a lot of nuance in that, obviously. And I think you'll see this. We're about to announce our plans for season 4 of the Token House. We're going to publish a preview of that tomorrow, and then full details on April 13th. And in there, we directly cite the DAOs that we've drawn inspiration from.
Okay, super cool. Okay, so first, I just want to make sure that I say this so that everybody knows. I'll share the links to the collective DAO archives under the spaces after it's done. So they're sort of out there and easy to find, and we'll talk about that. But if you're looking for them, I'll tweet them under this space when it's over. One thing I want to make sure that we talk about is you mentioned that you found actually that there are things that are the same across DAOs. Like you distilled this down into a presentation at ETH Denver on like your 10 takeaways from doing this research. So I think it would be super interesting for everybody listening to just kind of go through those, like the 10 highlights, the key takeaways that you learned about DAO broadly in doing this research. So do you want to just start, and then I'll try not to interrupt you too much?
Sure. Yeah. Or feel free to ask questions, right? Because
Yeah.
people can listen to ETH Denver talk, but if you have questions, then that will be like additional to that recording.
Okay,
So
sure.
the resources are organized into 10 categories. I subjectively categorized things into the categories that made sense to me. Somebody else might take it and make different categories. But I figured that like most people are not as like intense researchers as I am, and so maybe they don't want to read thousands of forum posts in their free time, which would be a totally reasonable thing to not want to do. So I figured like it would probably be most valuable if I could kind of distill what I learned in the process of reading all these posts and like putting these resources together to give like the TLDR to people that don't want to actually dig through everything. So the first kind of category that I looked at was voting. And so I think like people are probably familiar that most DAOs replicated direct democracies. So all token holders are voting on everything. That tends to be slow and also can be suboptimal for making certain types of decisions. So unsurprisingly, DAOs have like figured this out and transitioned towards more representative democracy. So they delegate decision making usually to an elected council members. So 70% of the DAOs that I looked at had some form of delegated decision making. The nuance, though, is that just like you don't want all token holders to vote on everything, you also don't want everything to be delegated. So the takeaway from this category is that like what you really want to do is match the decision making model to the decision type. So sometimes you want maximum decentralization, and sometimes you can actually tolerate less decentralization, and it'll allow for more context. And so Vitalik has a framework for thinking about when you might use different decision-making models, and he classifies decisions into convex or concave decisions. At Optimism, we're designed to segment decision-making types by plutocratic and non-plutocratic. So we get it. Like, I think we all know the downsides to plutocratic decision making, but there are instances where it actually could make sense. And so the token house uses, when I say plutocratic, I mean one token, one vote. More, if you have more tokens, you have more voting power. And that's how token house works. We have two houses in Optimism style, and they make decisions on protocol upgrades, growth of the ecosystem, things like inflation rate, etc. And so it kind of makes sense that like a plutocratic model makes sense for making those kind of like economically driven decisions. The Citizens House is non-plutocratic, so it's one member, one vote. And that's really important because they're making a totally different type of decision, which is closer to a type of decision that a sovereign would usually make. And that's how to allocate funds to public goods. And so that's like an example of how we're kind of implementing this takeaway and this principle at Optimism, right? So you don't always want plutocratic decisions. You don't always want non-plutocratic decisions. It's really about matching the decision-making model to the decision type.
Yeah, what I love about this takeaway is that it like kind of speaks directly to like a problem that I'm sure many people have observed with DAOs, is that there's a sense that the only way to do things is just to sort of like allocate votes based on like, tokens you've amassed on chain or something like that. And like just surfacing this idea that there's a way to create flexibility in the way that votes take place that adds a level of decentralization, kind of adheres to what is possible with on-chain governments. And it just like feels like it opens up space for just options, which is really great.
Yeah, I think if you have one tool to solve every problem, like that's obviously going to be a very frustrating experience. I think another example of when we've used this principle of optimism is in the beginning, we did have all token holders voting on all grant applications. And it was basically a suboptimal experience for everybody involved. And part of that is because you need people that have high context and the time to dedicate to understanding like each grant application. And so that's an instance actually where we found that it makes more sense, results in better decision making, et cetera, to have that be like a delegated decision that's kind of managed by a council. But all token holders, for example, approve the budget of that council. So that's another example where delegated decision making makes sense for some decisions, but not for all of them.
Awesome. Very cool. What do you think about takeaway 2?
Yeah. So the second category was strategy, which is something that's like really hard for DAOs to define. It's because it's hard to define collectively. And there's different frameworks for understanding why it's hard to define collectively. One is that it's an open question. And so Rune Christensen from Maker has said that open questions are kind of notoriously hard to decide collectively. And then it's also a convex decision, which is a different framework for thinking about it. The problem is if we don't define strategy, then the DAO tends to be directionless, and attention and treasury spend are just divided by an increasing number of things.
Mm-hmm.
The way that DAOs, young DAOs typically solve for this is that you have prominent leadership or core team that has a high degree of influence, and that can be effective at the beginning of the DAO's life. But then what we've seen in several instances is that you run into the succession problem, basically, as those leaders phase themselves out, which they need to do as the DAO decentralizes. There's kind of like there's no mechanism that fills the void that leader's influence used to. And so this is where this idea of creating prioritization frameworks come in. And these are frameworks that basically teach and train the community to make strategic decisions in a similar way, but on their own. And that's how you can have this strategy be more sustainable over time and also not dependent on any one person, which is obviously very important. So these can be like high level frameworks like values or guiding principles or scope or intent, like different DAOs call them different things. Or they can be more granular and it can be like literally setting KPIs and OKRs as long as they're kind of like set or ratified collectively. This sounds like really basic, but only 55% of the DAOs that I analyzed had a mission statement, vision, values, or public roadmap. Only 40% of them had anything that looked like a KPI. So again, pretty basic, but really important to increase the resilience of the DAO over time.
Yeah, I think that like that's so important. It's like, okay, you start a DAO with like a small core like leadership team, and then, if you're pursuing decentralization as a value, you only have a certain amount of time in which to kind of like maximize the impact of like tone setting, culture setting, value setting that leadership team can do. And so teaching the community like how to make decisions that align with a vision is a really valuable use of that time, it seems like.
Yeah, I also think it's common in DAOs to just kind of like turn everything over to the community with none of these frameworks or guidelines or structures or anything in place to kind of like help community members or delegates or train them how to make these decisions together. And then the tendency is to be like, well, see, the community can't make decisions or they make bad decisions. And it's like, okay, well, like that's not really like a fair characterization because they were given no tools to make those decisions together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. It's super interesting. Okay, what do we think about the next? I don't know. We're trying to be elegant.
That's okay. This treasury was the third category, and it's one of my favorite. And I would say like season 4 is very focused on trying to avoid many of the problems that I saw in my research on this. So basically, the takeaway here is that funding structure should be flexible. The majority of DAOs implement working groups, that resemble business units that are funded indefinitely to work on a specific domain. They tend to be funded individually outside the context of an overall DAO budget. Their individual budgets then usually consolidate into an overall budget that's unsustainable. At some DAOs, it was 3 times higher than a startup at a comparable stage. The worst part of this is actually that those budgets are underfunding core initiatives and overfunding non-strategic initiatives. So not only do you have an unsustainable budget, but it's not properly funding the highest priority things. Mm-hmm. So we're starting to see some DAOs test other structures, like funding structures that are not tied to a specific domain or that are not assumed to exist forever. So ENS has obviously experimented with an RFP program. There's some other DAOs. Cabin DAO has been experimenting with different structures. At one point it was Quest. Now I think they use a different structure. But I think we're very interested in experimenting with more flexible funding structures and trying to figure out how to fund and support work in the DAO outside of this working group construct.
Mm-hmm. I think I love this because it can tie in really nicely. You can start to see how you have like a set of steps for thinking about, running a DAO, right? Or like not running is a bad word, but you have a strategy and leadership are setting priorities and teaching strategic decision making. Like it's really easy to see how you could tie in like a treasury fund according to those priorities.
Yeah, so I think if you think about the categories that we've gone through so far, so voting is like which decisions is the DAO making? Strategy is what is the DAO doing? If you ask that question in a DAO, you'll get as many different answers as there are people in the DAO usually. And then the treasury is like how are we funding the thing that the DAO is doing basically.
Let's go to the next takeaway. And this one, when I heard of you talk about it, kind of blew my mind because you've distilled what some people might say is like the biggest issue in DAOs into like something that feels really like intuitive. Yeah. You want to talk about it?
Yeah, it's funny. So some of this sounds basic, but I understand why some basic things are not implemented. It's because we're starting from scratch, which presents a lot of opportunity to create new and amazing things. But yeah, sometimes we don't implement things that are like somebody who hasn't worked in DAOs as much would be like, are you kidding me? How do you not have a mission statement, for example? But that's okay. So the fourth category is accountability. And the main thing that we wanted, which is this is a big issue, I would think, at most DAOs. And what we really want to do is incentivize execution. It kind of makes sense. This is an issue in DAOs because DAOs are basically operate on proposals, which are promises. So the question here is like, how do we make sure that people fulfill their promises? And in most cases, we don't want to be adding a bunch of like legal enforcement mechanisms into the mix, right? Which that's kind of not the point. So this one of the forum posts that I thought was just fascinating when I was doing this research was Oregon actually had to designate themselves executor of last resort because so many proposals were passing that hadn't specified like the specific party that was going to execute what was in them. Right. So yeah, no wonder we have an execution problem when we're not even sure like who's supposed to be executing the thing. And because of this, like DAOs frequently express concerns that competitors are out competing them. So we like know in the traditional world how to incentivize execution. Basically, you want competition, speed, and experimentation. So the question is really like, how can we do that in a DAO setting? So one way to do that, which Cabin DAO has experimented with, is called duocracy. That concept is if it's below a certain threshold of funding, you don't have to ask really. Like you don't need permission. You can just have that funding go do the thing, show your results, and then probably be eligible for more funding. Urine Governance 2.0 introduced this idea of constrained delegation, which is basically like if you meet certain criteria, you can then manage a multi-sig, and you need approval to manage the multi-sig, but you don't need approval for every transaction that the multi-sig does. It just like allows you to move much faster. And then there's this concept of separation of powers between the parties that are responsible for making decisions about strategy, budgets, and execution. And you see that framework in both Maker's Endgame and Atom 2.0. And so the idea there is if you separate kind of like the person allocating the budgets from the people that are executing it and that are separating the strategy, you kind of create competition at each level.
Okay. And so then let's talk about like the things that sort of like make all of the components go, which is the organizational makeup of DAOs. Yeah.
This one was really interesting to me, and we've also seen this dynamic play out within our own DAO, Optimism. And so, like, the takeaway is jarring to most people that work in DAOs, but it's to define power structures. There's actually like a great quote from Rune Christensen who said, like, the really big problem with the complexity of MakerDAO is that it's not explicit and it's not written down. So a political dynamic of who's in alliance with who that you can't observe until it's in action. And so power dynamics exist within all DAOs, but we don't we're like uncomfortable with that, so we don't define them, which actually makes it worse, because if you haven't defined the power, then you can't hold it accountable. Like, undefined power is unchecked power. And perceived power vacuums also result in factions and like a really sometimes toxic dynamic where people are unofficially vying for this power. I think that this is more of an issue at DAOs that tend to push governance to the social layer, and that's because there's two types of power: hard power, which is easy to see and define, that's token ownership, and positional authority, like I was elected to a council or something. Power is like influence and decision making ability that's not explicit, and you tend to, that's more of like a social dynamic, and that one's a lot harder to kind of define and see. Only 30% of DAOs had published something that looked, that it looked like an org chart, basically explained like what the different bodies of power in the DAO were. Worse, only 55% had published a code of conduct. Like, a small percentage of those code of conducts were actually enforceable. So if you're going to define power, you need to make sure that you also have a mechanism to remove people that are abusing that power, right? Like, that part is critical to doing this. And it doesn't exist in most DAOs.
Yeah, that's so important. Undefined power is unchecked power, is just like I'll put that on a t-shirt. But also, like, yeah, like, let's talk about what happens when you don't sort of acknowledge just like a basic human impulse, which is kind of like, banding together in like groups, like lobbying for what you want, like, I don't know, compete. Like, it's just like, this is human activity that happens, and we know that it happens. So let's name it and kind of like put some guide rails down for how power is going to occur and be held accountable in these groups of people working together.
Right. So if there's an informal system through which decisions get made, meaning, I don't know, I need a back channel with like this specific person who's then going to tell everybody else how to vote or something, I don't know. And the only way I would know this is because I know someone in the DAO that kind of explained this informal system to me or whatever. And a bad decision is made. If we don't know who made the decision, one, how do we prevent another bad decision being made in the future? And two, how do we hold anybody accountable for that decision? Whereas if you have council, for example, and they make a bad decision, well, it's very clear who made the decision, and then hopefully you have a mechanism in place where they can be removed for making that decision.
For sure. Okay, so the next takeaway has to do with contributors. I love this one. I get on my soapbox about this. So I'm excited to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, so the takeaway for contributors is like, we need to make a distinction between contributors and representatives. So being a contributor has been really hard in most cases. And part of that is because like contributors have been faced with defending their roles and salaries publicly as often as every 3 months. Like, that sounds horrible. Like, who would like to sign up for that? Right? That sounds totally
No, thank you.
Yeah, and I would imagine like in that setting, that's very hard to do your work. So in a completely like in this model, which is what most DAOs started with, which was this kind of like direct to DAO hiring model, meaning like the token holders vote on every role that is hired in the DAO, and then they also fire those people and they decide on their salaries. The main mechanism that you have for accountability is public firing by token holders, which is like a pretty extreme event. There is not room for like softer accountability mechanisms like performance reviews or performance improvement plans, or like some of these like basic HR practices. So of the DAOs I analyzed, only 20% had like any codified hiring practices. 40% had some sort of formalized compensation policy, usually implemented like after a year and a half. So it's like, it's not that surprising. Contributor burnout is a really prevalent problem. Retention started to become an issue usually 7 months after these DAOs had started, and the ones that I analyzed. I think that we can improve the situation by making this distinction between representatives and contributors. So representatives directly manage DAO resources or make decisions that the token holders otherwise would, right? Like they kind of take token holders are like delegating their rights to them. Those people should be elected and they should be kind of like subject to this public firing by token holder thing. Contributors, which just do DAO work for the DAO, like, you know, run community groups or like make t-shirts or whatever, I don't think need to be held to that same level of public scrutiny.
Mhm. Yeah, and you just think about like the realness of how difficult it is to be a contributor in a DAO sometimes.
Yeah.
Like when the last bull run was over and kind of the market took a turn, and so there's less people in the space volunteering. Like I saw a lot of questions about like, I don't know, like how to incentivize people to continue to participate in DAOs. And I'm like, if it's a time of uncertainty and you as a human being don't know what to expect, you know, based on your contributions in a community group in a DAO, then you're not going to spend as much time there. You're going to go where things are a bit more certain, right? So this is like, yeah, I can see it helping with retention and just like morale and like motivation also.
Yeah, I mean, DAOs are literally built on the work that contributors do. And so I think we need to make sure that it's not a hostile environment where they feel like very insecure in their work all the time, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's go to the next takeaway. A fun one.
Yeah, so this path to decentralization. So obviously this really only applies to DAOs that are decentralizing from what was previously a centralized entity, and it's less applicable to DAOs that kind of are decentralized from the beginning, right? There's like two different ways that DAOs can begin. But in general, DAOs that progressively decentralize, just what we call it, when you go from centralized to decentralized, struggle with this transition. Basically on the community side, basically they're struggling for gradually more autonomy. On the core side, it's like the opposite, and they have to basically learn to let go of having control over things and go from being an employee to a contributor, which is actually like very different. So that's moving from a position of authority to a position of service, a position. When you're an employee, you do things directly. And when you work in the DAO, you set up the systems that allow other people to do it. When you work in a company, you want to be irreplaceable. When you work in a DAO, you need to make, like, the more successful you are, the more replaceable you are, because you can't be a single point of failure in that DAO. So it's like a completely different way of thinking about how, like, what success in your role looks like. So there's kind of like two things that you need to prepare both the community and the core team. So on the community side, I think the tension doesn't usually exist around the fact that there is control. It's usually that it's ambiguous where the control is and what the plan is for transferring it to the community, or if there is a plan. Sometimes there's not really. And so I think, again, just defining that as much as possible, like, okay, here's where the control currently exists and here's how we're going to transition it to the community over time, really helps a lot. On the core team side, I haven't seen this happen a lot. It's something that we're about to experiment with at Optimism, but is like hosting educational workshops like early in this process that help employees kind of understand what this transition is going to look like and what it means to be a contributor and what are like the additional skills that they're going to need to develop to work better in the DAO.
That's super cool. I think that like this is a thread that is running throughout all of these takeaways, but it's like so much can be done by just like making the ambiguous things unambiguous, right? Like just defining, being clear, consistent, communicating in a frank way, like what the plan is and what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's part of the adjustment, right? That's probably the biggest difference that I noticed when I went from working at centralized companies to working kind of like in DAOs, is like the level of transparency. It completely different and it changes everything.
I just also like on a personal level too, like when you know what's going on, like it's so much easier to sort of like buy into a process than when you just kind of feel like you're in the dark a bit. I don't know. Cool. Okay. We've got three more takeaways, and I want to leave time at the end to talk a bit about season 4 and like how we're trying to implement these takeaways at Optimism. So, yeah, takeaway 8.
Yeah, so this is around policy, and like the main goal, the main takeaway and our main goal also at Optimism is to maintain transformability. So DAOs have actually had really low transformability. I think RN DAO did a community study, and this was like one of the conclusions that they came to. And that's for a few reasons. But one, like DAOs tend to implement structure and create policy reactively, which makes total sense because DAOs are emergent. We don't know what's going to happen before it happens. The problem is that we tend to overspecify and then overcorrect to prevent like a very specific thing from happening again in the future. And then we end up with like a bunch of rigid policy that just doesn't actually like prevent any of the things from happening in the first place. So I'm not advocating for the opposite. I'm not saying like no policy, because DAOs that have had no structure or no policy have basically collapsed. Part of the reason is because like if you leave important parameters undefined, then norms get defined by precedent, which is just like an unintentional way to set policy, right? So like maybe this precedent has been set, and it's not necessarily the precedent that you would have intentionally set, but now you're stuck with it. And this creates this like common law system that's also really path dependent, right? So this thing happened and it was handled in this way, so now that's the precedent. So now forever forward, that's how we handle these things, and we can't change it because the whole thing's based on that precedent. So again, this leads to like a system where the ability to change is like very low, and DAOs are changing every day, so the ability to change needs to be very high. Our approach to optimism is to have like a very minimized governance system so that the DAO is more flexible. Part of how we think about that is asking ourselves, like, what is the process to change this process? We have reflection periods, which are basically a 2-week period where we reflect on the experiments that we've run. We get feedback from delegates. We propose changes based on what we've learned, etc. So that's like one mechanism that we have for that. I think, again, this kind of goes back to the strategy thing, but instead of having a bunch of prescriptive rules that are always going to fall short because like all these edge cases are going to arise, we should really be trying to equip the community with frameworks to make decisions when they're faced with unknowns, because that's like just the reality of your day to day in a DAO. You can write a new rule every day and you're still going to miss things. And then when I was doing my research, like the healthiest DAOs had the least amount of policy. So policy is like color coded in like this beige color in the timelines. And so it's easy to see like, oh, this DAO had like tons of policy, but was still like quite dysfunctional, or vice versa. And part of that is because the DAOs that had the least policy but were like highly functional, when something happened, they didn't add a new rule. They went back and like redesigned the system so that you couldn't exploit it again.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about like how do you make all of this happen? Like what are the tools? What is the most important things related to tooling like that you found?
Yeah, so there's like this quote that's in the hard thing about the hard things that talks about basically organizational structures being communication maps. And so I don't see why that wouldn't apply to DAOs. The problem is with most DAOs, the communication is like pretty one way. Like communication from the top down is always like solid, like core team to the community. But a lot of times it doesn't seem like the core team is hearing the community, right? Or like the community input just doesn't like reach the places it needs to reach. And so you can see this in the fact that like user research or community surveys is still pretty rare. Like some DAOs do this, but it's rare. Data driven decision making barely exists. If it does, it's mostly around risk and financial analysis, but it's not about like the quality of decision making or operations or anything like that. And so basically, like I think that we need to do a better job of collecting and incorporating contributor feedback, which is something we try to prioritize a lot at Optimism, but I mean, because there's still a long ways to go and there's much more that we could be doing.
Yeah, well, and some of that contributor feedback is bound to be concerns. And I found that this is like such a poignant place to end because it's very real. We see it all the time. So what was your main takeaway there when it comes to contributor concern?
Yeah, this one was the most surprising takeaway. And not everyone's going to agree with it, and that's fine. But it is a framework that we use at Optimism, like on a daily basis. So some DAOs collapse, right? That's a thing that happens. And so I looked at some of the DAOs that have had a lot of conflict or that collapse or whatever. And the presence of conflict doesn't actually appear to be a distinguishing factor, right? It's not like, oh, at every DAO where there was a huge blow up, they just couldn't recover from it. And then that says something about the recoverability of DAOs. That's not what I saw. I saw some DAOs have massive conflict and come back from it. Like I also saw there other DAOs that had like relatively minor things happen, but then were dissolved actually. So what I perceived to be the difference was legitimacy. And Vitalik outlines a framework for like 6 ways by which you can establish legitimacy. And those are brute force, continuity, fairness, process, performance, and participation. So an example of like negating legitimacy by process would be like if the foundation violated our own process, that negates the legitimacy of our governance process. Or if we made a decision that token holders were supposed to be involved in and didn't involve them in that, that would be negating our legitimacy because we negated participation. The reason that legitimacy is so important in DAOs is because this is another essay from Vitalik, but he explains why DAOs are closer to sovereigns than corporations. And legitimacy is created endogenously in sovereign systems, which means there's not like an external mechanism that reinforces it. So if you negate your legitimacy, there's like no way to reinforce it externally. So yeah, so that exactly. So that loss of legitimacy through any of those 6 that we outlined not always, but like can lead to the collapse of the DAO. So it is an existential risk. And so at Optimism, we're making decisions and I'm like, oh, is this going to violate process? Is this going to violate continuity? Are we using brute force to do this thing? If the answer is yes, then it's like a hard no, we're not doing that.
Yeah, it was like you set expectations, you work really hard to like create all of these frameworks and policies and like make promises. And so it's like it's important to like the minute you sort of violate those unilaterally, it's like, you're not even a DAO, you're not doing what you're saying you're doing. Like it's like you can see how that would be true. And whereas if something goes wrong and you sort of like are, follow your policy and like have a period of conflict, but it's like you're working it out the way that it was intended, you can see how there's a way to recover from that, right?
Yeah, a lot of times this is like doing the hard thing or the suboptimal thing or the thing that you wouldn't otherwise choose, but you have to do it for the viability of the DAO.
For sure. And so you've been like referring to like the seasons that the foundation and the collective run, where these like periods of experimentations happen, where you like will kind of like set, an experiment that relates to what you learned in this research process. Like what is a season? Simply, like, how does it work? How do you approach them? Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so Token House operates on seasons, which it's not a set period of time. It's kind of however long we think they need to be to run that particular experiment. So let's call it roughly a quarter. That can change in the future, but that's roughly what it looks like now. And we have between seasons, we have what we call a reflection period, and that's where we get feedback from delegates and we introduce proposals for like experiments we would like to try in the next season. sometimes those need to be voted on, or there needs to be elections or whatever, and those happen kind of during those reflection periods. And then those experiments run for the next season, which again is like a quarter. And we kind of keep doing this process. The rate of change has been pretty high each season, I think, like surprisingly so, but the expectation for experimentation was set very early by the foundation. And so our delegates, I think, are very open to trying things. They're also time-bound experiments. So let's say you're not like 100% convinced that this experiment we want to do is like the way to go. There's more openness to being like, all right, well, I'll try it for 2 months, and if I hate it, I'm voting it down.
Yeah. And is that what you would say is the main benefit of approaching governance this way? Like, how did you land on, like, it's like a pretty intentional way of organizing governance and like approaching decentralization, like time bound seasons where you introduce ideas and then they can be scrapped. So, how did you land on that? And like, what's the benefit of doing it that way?
So I can't take credit for this. This was like something that was already established in the Constitution, like when I joined the foundation. So kudos to the people that came
Yeah.
up with this, because it wasn't me. But in terms of like why it's useful is for exactly that reason. It allows us to have a high degree of transformability, to try something, to scrap it, which is that kind of intellectual honesty and willingness to start over is something that's like really core to the kind of founding team at Optimism. Again, the time bound nature does lead to more openness to trying things because it's for a set period of time, and then there's an opportunity to say, I don't want this to continue. But it's also, it gives us a natural point to kind of reassess and reevaluate.
Yeah. And do you find that you're using like the research you did for the archives, for the library, like in as you think about this process and moving it forward?
Yes, definitely. So in season 4, like you'll see, I think, heavy influence in strategy and in treasury, accountability, how we're thinking about designing these kind of frameworks to allow the community to make these decisions for itself. Like I think when we publish the season 4 plan, like you'll be, like I said, you'll be able to see the influence from this research, but then we're also going to directly name the DAOs that we, like either leveraged experiments they ran or took direct inspiration from. I'm actually like updating the archives right now because it's just research that I need to do for my job. And then everyone's really annoyed because I'm sending them all these random forum posts that I'm finding like in the deep, dark corners of the governance web because there's like, so again, there's so much stuff on these forums and it's relevant to like many different projects that people are working on, even not related to governance.
Yeah. And I can imagine at a point like that will become unsustainable for you. Like it's not a process that scales, maintaining that. So, how in the long term are you thinking about keeping this resource usable and up to date?
Yeah, so I think this is something like in season 4 that we want to, we want to support, figure out a way to support people who want to kind of like build on, help maintain, expand, whatever these resources. I think what's really necessary and would be really great is kind of like a open source framework for how to contribute to these resources and make it so right now I'm the only person that maintains it. That's not like a very open source system. I'm just doing that because I like use these resources and just add to them as I'm doing my job. But again, I can't be like a single point of failure. What if one day I get tired and I'm like, I'm not updating this anymore? Then that's not good for the community. So we need to find like a way for the community to maintain and update and build on these resources. And also like I've organized these in like a very subjective way, in a way that makes sense to me. I had to make calls on how I categorize things and which forum posts I included and which I didn't. And I use the resources to do specific things. Somebody else might organize them in a different way, and they might make different categories, and they might include different forum posts, and they might also use them to do different things. And that's like what's cool about it being an open source like database and timelines, basically, is that it can be used and interpreted in many different ways.
Yeah, for sure. I'm so excited to see how this resource grows. I use it like I think about these things as I'm like writing in my day-to-day job. It's so useful for me because all of this stuff is new, and I think organizing as a DAO like contradicts the way of thinking you were sort of like taught in our societies growing up. Like it's just like very jarring sometimes to think about doing things in a different way. So it's super helpful that you put all this together. Do you have any last things that you want to share with anybody related to this? A reminder that I'll post a link to them underneath the space when this wraps up.
No, just that I think like, so we could have just kept these resources internal, right? And I could have just been like, oh, like I have this master database to do like whatever, all this governance work and whatever. But I think like our ethos is really like make things open source public goods, and then the value that's created will be so much more magnified than the value I could extract from this resource by keeping it private and to myself, right? And so an example of that is like the people that have reached out that are interested in expanding the resources to include the types of DAOs that they work in or that they're interested in, or the people that want to add additional context on top, or they want to organize the resources in a different way or whatever. And it's like this whole thing will be so much more and so much more useful to so many more people because it's an open source public good than if we just kept it for ourselves at Optimism.
Mm-hmm. It's always amazing to see what people do. People do things that you never even expect when you make something public. So it's exciting to see what this might turn into. Public goods are good. And that's a great place to end this on. Thank you so much for talking to me about this, for creating this resource, and for being you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for listening. Mac will be back next week for the next OP Radio, so stay tuned and have a great day.